Half-blind butcher won a failing tannery for 55 cents. 7 girls ran the vats. The card I laid down was a 3 of clubs and a 7 of spades. Garbage. The man across from me had the look of someone sitting on kings, both hands flat on the table, thumbs tucked under, real patient the way a man gets when he knows he's already won. But the pot had grown to something I couldn't walk away from, and at the bottom of it was a folded document I hadn't read, which I maybe should have. 55 cents was all I had left, coin by coin. I slid them to the center. The man across from me glanced at the pile, smirked the way men smirk, and called. "I won on a bluff, I don't know how." Dealer told me later he'd been watching my left eye, the one that doesn't track right since the ox hook at the Delaney slaughter in '73, and said it confused the other fella so badly he couldn't read me at all. Something in my favor for once, that ruined eye. I took the pot. I took the coins. And I took the folded document without unfolding it because the man who'd lost it was already standing and his hand was moving toward his belt, and I thought it wise to be somewhere else. I unfolded it 2 streets over under a canopy lamp, rain coming sideways off the mountain. It read, Deed of Ownership, Holt & Sons Tannery, Calhoun Creek, Territorial, Wyoming. 1 building, 4 outbuildings, 6 operational vats, 4 non-operational, 1 curing shed. Then a line at the bottom in different ink. 7 employees, current status unknown. I stood in the rain a while. I was 46 years old. I had 55 cents and a deed to a tannery I'd never heard of. I'd been a butcher my whole life. I knew how to break down a carcass in 12 minutes. I knew where the money was in every part of the animal. I knew hides. I did not know tanning. I did not know Calhoun Creek. What I knew was that I had nothing else. The road to Calhoun Creek took 4 days by wagon, which I mostly walked beside because the animal I'd hired didn't like weight on the boards. The man at the livery in Casper told me it was a good road in summer. This was October. He was technically correct that it had been a good road in summer. My left boot had a crack along the welt that let in water. By the 2nd day, I'd wrapped my foot in a strip of canvas off the wagon bed. By the 3rd day, the canvas had rotted through and I gave up. The cold didn't bother me much anymore. That's what I told myself. I came down into the creek valley at dusk on the 4th day, and the tannery was the first building I saw. It was not inspiring. The main shed leaned, not dramatically, the way buildings lean when they're failing, but with a kind of permanent resignation, like a man who's been tired for too long. The sign above the door had lost 2 letters, and the remaining one spelled something that wasn't a word. The vat yard was surrounded by a split-rail fence, half of which was on the ground. There was lamplight inside. I tied the horse to a post that held and walked to the door. I knocked. From inside came the sound of something heavy being set down, then boots on a plank floor, not 1 pair, several, and then the door opened and a woman looked at me. Not young, not old. Somewhere in her 30s, dark hair pulled back hard, hands that were stained deep brown up past the wrists in a way that didn't wash out. Tanner's hands. Her eyes went to my face, then to the wagon behind me, then back to my face. She said, "What do you want?" It wasn't really a question, it was a test. I said, "My name is Cutter Hayes. I appear to own this building." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and said, "You'd better come in then." Her name was Nora Vess. She was the eldest of the 7, which was how she thought of them, the 7, though 2 of them were not her sisters and one was barely 15. They'd been working the tannery for 11 months since Aldous Holt had disappeared one afternoon and not come back. No one knew whether he'd died or just walked. His sons had never been real. The name above the door was the last thing he'd left behind. Nora had kept the operation running. Not because she'd been paid, she hadn't, not for 4 months, but because there were 6 other women in this building, and the valley's next town was 40 miles north, and winter was coming. She had kept it running through competence and rage in roughly equal measure. She explained this to me in about 4 minutes, standing at a long table with a lantern between us, her arms crossed, chin level. The other women stayed in the far end of the room. I could feel them watching, but I didn't look. I kept my eyes on Nora. When she finished, I said, "How much hide is in the yard?" She blinked. That was apparently not what she'd expected. She said, "Enough to cure through March if we can keep the vats heated." I said, "What's wrong with the non-operational vats?" She said, 2 have cracked lining, 1 lost a drain seal. The 4th, the lye mix went wrong and it ate the timber. I said, "The lye one's probably not salvageable. The other 3 I can fix." She looked at me differently then. Not warmly, I don't want to give the wrong impression. more like she was revising an estimate. She said, "You know tanning." I said, "I know hides, and I know how to repair things." She said, "Those are not the same as knowing tanning." I said, "No, but they're a start, and I've got the deed." A long pause. Behind her, one of the younger women whispered something to another. Nora didn't turn around. She said, "There's a room at the back of the curing shed. It's cold, but it's dry. You can have it." That was the deal we made. No handshake. She turned back to the table. I went to find my room. I don't know what I expected. I suppose I didn't expect anything in particular, because I'd learned by then that expectation was a kind of debt you took on that would eventually collect. What I found was a shed. A cot, a wool blanket that smelled of lanolin, and something else I didn't identify. A small iron stove that worked if you didn't ask too much of it. A window the size of a Bible facing east. I lay on that cot the first night with my wet boot propped on the stove lip and listened to the creek below the bank and thought about what I had. A deed. A broken building. 7 women who had no reason to trust me. A left eye that pointed the wrong direction in cold weather. What I didn't have. Money, tools, materials, reputation, any particular reason for optimism. What I had done before. Fed myself since I was 12, buried 2 employers, worked in blood and cold and heat and noise my whole life without complaint. Fixed every broken thing in every building I'd ever worked in because no one else would. And learned, slowly, badly, but learned, that the only thing worth a damn was what you could do with your hands when things went sideways. I slept. In the morning, I started on the Vats. The first thing I did was walk every inch of the property alone. I had a habit from the slaughterhouses. You walk a space before you work it. You look at what it tells you. What's failing, what's being held together by habit, what's actually sound. The tannery told me quite a bit. The main shed was better than it looked. The lean was cosmetic. A corner post had rotted at the base, but the main frame was old-growth timber and hadn't shifted. I could fix the post. The vats in operation were in good shape, better than I'd have guessed, because Nora had been methodical about maintenance. I could see it in the lining, in the way the drainage had been managed. Someone had been paying attention. The curing shed roof had 3 bad shingles that were letting in water at the northeast corner, which was going to ruin hides if it wasn't addressed before the next real rain. The fence around the yard was decorative at best, which didn't matter for function, but mattered if anyone was going to take this place seriously. I came back to the main building at mid-morning. Nora was at the Vats with 2 of the women, a girl named Ruth and a woman I'd later know as Disna, who was maybe 50 and had arms like a man twice her size and never spoke unless she meant it. They were working the lime bath on a stretch of cattle hide, turning it with long wooden paddles, and the smell was the particular dense rot salt smell of that process that hits you in the back of the throat. I watched for about 5 minutes without saying anything. Nora noticed without turning. She said the corner post needs replacing. I said, "I know, I'll need to source timber." She said, "There's a stand of tamarack 2 miles up the creek. Aldous had an agreement with the man who owns it. I don't know if that agreement still holds." I said, "Who's the man?" She said, "Name's Prentice Chalk. He's not easy." I said, "Most things worth having aren't." She turned then, just enough to look at me over her shoulder. Whatever she made of that she kept to herself. She turned back to the vat. I went to find Prentice Chalk. He was not easy. He was a compact man in his 60s who lived alone on a creekside claim that was impeccably maintained. Every fence post plumb, the yard raked, the woodpile stacked with an almost deliberate exactness. He opened the door before I knocked, which meant he'd seen me coming. He looked at my eye. He looked at my hands. He looked at the wagon. He said, "You the new owner at Holt's?" I said, "Appears so." He said, "You know what you're doing." I said, "Not entirely." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said Aldous Holt was a fool and a liar and owed me $30. "You're not him." I said, "No." He said, "Then we can probably do business. I'll want payment in finished leather, not coin. First delivery before the snow." I said, "Done." He said, "I'll need to see that you mean it." I said, "Come see the Vats in 2 weeks." He didn't smile, but something in his face settled, the way a man's face settles when he decides to wait and see rather than dismiss. I drove the wagon up the creek and cut timber. The 3 weeks after that were the kind of weeks you don't think about much later because they weren't about anything except work. I fixed the corner post. I relined 2 of the cracked vats with a clay and lime mix I'd seen a man use in Kansas, not Tannery standard, but functional. I replaced the drain seal on the 3rd with a leather gasket, which Nora thought was a bad idea and which I did not tell her held in worse conditions than this. It held. I shingled the curring shed roof in a day and a half in wind that came off the mountain like it had somewhere to be. The women had their system and I didn't touch it. That was deliberate. They'd built something functional under conditions that should have killed it, and they didn't need a man arriving with a deed and rearranging their methods. What I could do was handle the things the building needed that they hadn't had the time or the muscle for. So I did those things. Ruth brought me coffee one morning. She was the youngest, 15 or 16, small and quick, with the kind of watchful eyes that have seen more than they should have at that age. She set the tin cup on the workbench next to where I was reseating a vat bracket and said, "Nora says you fixed the roof right." I said the roof wasn't complicated. She said the other fellow who tried it left a seam that let in an inch of water every rain. I said then he didn't fix it. She considered this. She said Nora doesn't say things like that about men's work usually. I didn't say anything to that, but I held on to it. Prentice Chalk came in 2 weeks exactly. He walked the vat yard without speaking, looked at the relined walls, worked the drain on the 3rd vat twice, looked at the ceiling of the curring shed where I'd shingled. He looked at the women working. He looked at the ledger Nora kept, which she offered him without being asked, and he read 3 pages of it. Then he looked at me. He said that clay lining won't last more than a season. I said, I know. I'll do it proper in spring when I have the materials. He said Aldous never fixed anything, just kept buying new. I said Aldous isn't here. Another long look. Then he said, I'll bring you 12 tamarack on Friday. He left. Nora was standing at the far vat. She hadn't come over during the conversation, but she'd been in earshot. She said, without looking up, he hasn't extended credit to anyone out here in 4 years. I said I didn't ask for credit. She said no, that's why he did it. November came with the kind of cold that has weight to it. You can feel it pressing on the walls of the building, feel it in the ground underfoot, hear it in the way the creek changes pitch at night. We worked, the 7 women and me. The rhythm of it was a specific thing, the lime pits in the morning, the neutralizing wash, the fat scraping, the stretch drying, steam and cold, and the constant smell of the process. My hands were raw for the first 2 weeks, and then they weren't. You build calluses where you need them. I learned tanning, not from a book. From watching Nora, and occasionally when I couldn't figure something from watching, asking. She answered without making it a thing. That's a particular kind of teaching, where the other person doesn't perform the knowledge, just gives it to you clean and moves on. The best teachers I've known have all done it that way. Disna taught me the drum timing for the barktan bath without being asked. She just came and stood beside me one morning when I was watching the drum and said, 20 more minutes. Wrong hide weight you're timing for. I said, how do you know the hide weight by eye? She showed me. It took her about 2 minutes. I've used that knowledge every day since. The girl Ruth turned out to be the best at the fat scraping, which is the worst work, the most physical and the most foul-smelling, and she did it without complaint and with a precision that I respected enough to tell her so. She stood a little straighter after that. People need to hear what they're good at, especially young ones. There was a night in late November when something went wrong with the lime bath in the 2nd vat. I don't know what, the chemistry of it went off somehow. The pH shifted in a direction it shouldn't have, and by morning the hide in that bath had begun to degrade. We pulled it. Nora assessed it while I held the lantern. She turned the hide slowly, hands sure and methodical, face unreadable. Then she set it aside. She said, we'll salvage the lower 3rd. The rest is waste. I said, how much does that cost us? She didn't answer immediately. She was doing the math. Then she said, puts us 3 hides short of what we need by January. I said, can we source more cattle before the cold locks in? She said, Morrow Ranch, maybe. But Hank Morrow didn't like Aldous, might not like us by association. I said, I'll go in the morning. She said, Cutter. That was the first time she'd used my name. I noticed it. I don't think she did. She said, Morrow's not an easy man either. He'll read you. I said, they all read me. The eye doesn't help. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, it's not the eye doesn't matter. It's that you go at men like you've already decided you're not going to like them, and then you're surprised when it comes back right. I looked at her. She was looking at the ruined hide. I said that a fair assessment. She said it's what I've seen. I thought about that on the drive to Morrow's in the morning. I went in differently. Hank Morrow was in fact not an easy man, but I must have come at him differently because he sold me 4 cattle hides at a reasonable price and threw in a 5th because, he said, anyone keeping that tannery alive in this weather had his respect. I drove back in the early afternoon with the hides in the wagon bed and the cold coming down off the mountain and thought about what Nora had said. She had read me correctly. She'd taken the trouble to read me correctly. That's not a small thing. December. The valley got its first real snow on the 3rd day of the month and it didn't stop for 4 days. We were inside almost entirely. There was less to do in terms of the physical operation but more to do in terms of preparation, the inventory, the ledger, the planning for spring. Nora ran all of that. I sat with her 2 evenings to go over it. The first evening she had a number wrong, a column that didn't reconcile. She caught it herself before I mentioned it, erased it, corrected it, moved on. I didn't say anything. I watched her work. The precision of it. The way she held the pencil, the way she turned the ledger page exactly right so as not to crease the binding. A person who has always done things the right way when no one was watching. You can tell that. It's in how they handle objects. The second evening I said, "You've been keeping this whole operation in your head this whole time." She said, "Had to." I said, "You didn't have to, you could have walked." She looked up then, she said, "To where?" I said, "Anywhere, you had skills. Tannery work, you could have gone north, found a place." She said, "I had 6 women here." I said, "That's why you stayed." She looked at me for a moment and then looked back at the ledger. She said, "That's part of it." I didn't ask what the other part was. I didn't think it was my question to ask. Prentice Chalk brought 2 men out from town on a Friday in mid-December. Not to cause trouble, I need to say that, but because word had gotten around that the tannery was operational and producing, and people in a valley that size want to know what they're dealing with. The men were a general merchant named Burke and a rancher named Tullows. They were the kind of men who have appointed themselves the unofficial assay office of a community, who decide whether a thing is worth taking seriously. They walked the yard. They inspected the curing shed. They talked to Chalk more than to me, which was fine. I showed them the ledger which Nora handed me without being asked, and I let the numbers speak. The numbers were honest. November's numbers especially were better than anyone's had a right to expect, given the equipment and the conditions and the staff. Burke said, "You've been in this trade long." I said, "New to tanning, I know hides." He said, "Former butcher." I said, "Yes." He said, "And the women?" I said, "Have been running this operation for close to a year. What you're looking at, that's their work." Tullows looked at Nora, who was standing at the edge of the yard. He looked back at me. He said, "Holt never gave them any credit." I said, "Holt wasn't here anymore." Chalk watched this exchange. He said quietly to Burke beside me, the corner post, the vat lining the shed roof. "New man did all of that in 3 weeks." I heard it. I wasn't supposed to, maybe, but I heard it. Burke said to me, "You plan on staying?" I said, "I plan on making this worth staying at." Burke and Tullows left. Chalk stayed. He had a cup of coffee in the main shed with me and Nora, and he didn't say much, and when he left he said, "There'll be a merchant from Casper coming through in February. He'll want to look at your spring inventory. I'll send word ahead." After he left, Nora stood in the door of the main shed watching the road. She said, "You know what Chalk just did?" I said, "Yes." She said, "He vouched for us." I said, "He vouched for the work. That's better." She was quiet, then she said, "He vouched for you." I turned that over. I said, "For both of us. The numbers are yours." She didn't argue, but I could see what it meant to her, not the praise. She wasn't a person who needed praise, but the record being set straight. The numbers being called hers. That's a different thing. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Disna made a potato stew that was better than anything I'd eaten in years. I don't know what she did to it. She wouldn't say. The younger women sang something after, a hymn or close to it, in a language I didn't know. Nora sat next to me at the long table, and for the first time she didn't have anything to be doing with her hands, and so she just sat, and that was its own kind of thing. I had the specific feeling I hadn't had in a long time of being somewhere that made sense. Not comfortable, exactly. The room was cold, and the stove was working too hard, and the smell of the tannery was part of the air the same way it always was. But I was somewhere that was mine, or partly mine, or mine to tend. and there were people in it. And one of them was sitting beside me, and for no reason at all I was thinking about how she'd said it's not the eye doesn't matter, and how she'd meant it. January brought two things I hadn't planned for. The first was a storm that took the northeast corner of the fence entirely and pushed a pine down against the Curring shed door, which jammed it. The second was a man named Garrow who arrived on a Thursday morning claiming that he held a prior lien on the property from a transaction with Aldous Holt, dated 8 months earlier, and that my deed was therefore encumbered. I read his document, then I read it again. Garrow was a big man with a deliberate manner, the kind of man who'd done this before. He was patient about it. He stood in the yard and let me read, and he said, "I'm not unreasonable, but I'll need to see a resolution." I said, "When was this lien filed?" He said, "August of last year." I said, "With what court?" He said, "Territorial." I said, "Then there'll be a record." He said, "There will." I said, "I'll need 2 weeks." He said, "You have 1. He left. Nora had been listening from the doorway of the main shed. She came out. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Is it real?" I said, "I don't know, maybe." She said, "If it is." I said, "If it is, it's a problem, but I don't think it is." She looked at me. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "The deed I won, the date on it, and a man with a horse who can get to the Territorial Records office in 6 days. She said, "Desna's nephew. He's fast and he's reliable." I said, "Ask him." She went. I stood in the cold yard looking at the down pine against the Curring shed door and thought about what I'd said. I don't think it is. I believed that. The date on my deed was October after Garrow's claimed lien, which meant either the lien was fraudulent or the man who'd lost the deed to me in the card game hadn't owned it cleanly when he'd wagered it. Either way, there was a story, and stories could be found. Desna's nephew, a young man named Cree, thin and serious-faced, who wore a cavalry surplus coat 3 sizes too large, left the next morning before dawn. I watched him go from the window of my Curring shed room. The week Cree was gone was the hardest of my time at the tannery. Not because of the work was the same, but because Garrow came back on the 3rd day and stood in the yard without being invited and watched us work. He didn't speak. He just stood there in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets and watched. I didn't look at him. I let him stand. Nora worked through it. All 7 of them worked through it. Not one of them gave Garrow the satisfaction of changing what she was doing. I watched that. A man in the yard trying to make them feel contingent and uncertain, and 7 women who'd been contingent and uncertain before I arrived, before I mattered to anything, just kept working. Garrow left after an hour. I don't know what he thought he'd accomplish. On the 5th day, Nora came to my room after supper. She knocked, which she'd never done before. She'd always come to find me at the work, never at the room. I opened the door. She said, "I found something, in Aldis's papers." There was a box of them in the floor of the Curring shed I'd never opened because I assumed it was building records. I said, "Come in." She came in. It was a small room and cold, and there was only the 1 chair, so I sat on the cot, and she took the chair and put the box on the floor between us and opened it. It wasn't building records. It was correspondence, letters from Garrow, going back 2 years, various proposed arrangements, various schemes. And near the bottom, a letter in Aldis's own hand, never sent, that described the lien in plain terms as a coerced instrument. Garrow had threatened Aldis with a debt claim from another transaction, and the lien had been signed under duress. Nora read it aloud, then she looked up. She said, "That makes it unenforceable." I said, "It makes it contestable. That's not the same as winning." She said, "Do you have a lawyer?" I said, "Not currently." She said, "Prentice Chalk knows a man in Casper. Old one, honest." I said, "How do you know he's honest?" She said, "Because Chalk vouched for him the same way he vouches for anyone, without making a thing of it." I thought about that. Then I said, "You know the Valley's people better than I do." She said, "I've been here longer." I said, "I know. I'm not saying that to take anything from you. I'm saying I see it, that you know this place, the people, the dealings, the history." She was quiet. Outside the window, the creek was frozen enough to hear it differently, a lower sound, the water moving under the ice. She said, "Cutter, what are you planning to do with this place?" I said, "Run it right, make it solvent, make it worth something." She said, "And after that?" I said, after that it depends on what there is after that. She looked at me for a long moment in the lamplight. Then she said, when I kept this running, the 11 months before you came, I thought I was doing it until something better came along. For all of us. A solution. I said, and? She said, and nothing better came. Men came. Passing buyers, a speculator out of Cheyenne, 2 men who wanted to run it as something other than a tannery. All of them looking at the building. None of them looking at what we'd built in it. I let her finish. She said, you looked at the vats. First thing you asked about the vats. I said, I know hides. She said, you knew to ask about what we'd done, not what you were acquiring. I didn't say anything for a moment. The lamp was burning low. I could smell the tannery the way I always could. It's in everything after a while, the bark and the lime and the fat, and it was just the smell of the place I lived now. I said, you built something real, under bad conditions with no backing. Whatever I hold the deed on, the thing itself, that's yours. She looked at me steady. Then she said, I think maybe it could be ours. I held that. She didn't move to qualify it or take it back. She just let it sit there in the cold room the way a true thing sits when you've finally said it. Cree came back on the 7th day at dusk, frozen half solid, with a document from the Territorial Records Office. The lien had been filed, yes, and voided by the court 11 days later on grounds of procedural failure. Garrow had never completed the filing. The lien was dead. I took the document and rode to where Garrow was staying, a room at a cattle camp 6 miles south, and I showed it to him. He read it. He handed it back. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said Holt always made it complicated. I said, Holt isn't here. I rode back in the dark, the cold coming off the mountain, the horse picking its own way on the road. When I came into the yard, the main shed was lit from inside, lamplight in the window. I could see shapes moving inside. I tied the horse and stood for a moment in the yard. I thought about 55 cents, a card game in a town I hadn't been planning to stay in, a folded document I hadn't read. I thought about what it costs to get somewhere worth being. Spring came early that year. The first warm week in March, the snow on the valley floor went fast, the creek ran high and loud, and the mud was everywhere the way it is, the particular Wyoming mud that is almost a physical argument against anything organized. We opened the 4th vat, which I'd spent February on properly, real ceramic lining, proper drainage, the way Nora had described the original specification. It was better than the others. The merchant from Casper came in the 2nd week of March, a man named Aldridge who wore a coat that was too good for the road he'd traveled, and who I immediately liked because he didn't pretend not to notice the mud on his boots. He looked at the operation. He looked at the inventory. He had a long conversation with Nora about the curing process, and she answered him directly and technically, and without any of the performance of deference I'd seen women put on for men they needed something from. She just answered, he respected it, you could see him respect it. Aldridge placed an order that was larger than the whole of our previous autumn. He shook Nora's hand first, which I noticed, and then mine. After he left, Chalk came over from the road where he'd been talking to Aldridge's driver. He said to me, not quietly, Aldridge doesn't place orders like that unless he sees a going concern. I said, it is one. Chalk said, you should raise the fence. I said, I know, I've been planning to. He said, the whole valley's watching this place. Might as well give them something worth looking at. He said it in a way that meant something beyond the fence. I let him have it. That afternoon late, the light going gold the way it does in early spring when there's still snow on the peaks, and the valley is suddenly alive again, Nora came to find me at the corner post I was digging. I was in the ground to my elbows, the new post laid beside the hole, the soil still cold 6 inches down. She crouched down at the edge of the dig, forearms on her knees. She said, Aldridge's number. I said, I know. She said, it changes what's possible in the fall. I said, it changes a lot. She was quiet, then she said, I've been thinking about the deed. I looked up at her. She said, it ought to have both our names on it. I said, legally that's a... She said, I know what it is legally. I'm not asking about legally. I'm asking what you think. I set down the spade. I was still in the hole, which made me shorter than her for once, and she was looking down at me with the spring light on her face, and the tanner's stain on her hands, and the particular expression she had when she'd made up her mind about something, and was checking whether I was going to make it difficult. I said, I think you're right. She didn't smile. She wasn't a woman who smiled to fill a silence. But something in her face settled, the same way Chalk's face had settled that first day, the deciding to wait and see replaced by something that didn't need to wait anymore. She put her hand on my shoulder, just for a moment, steady and sure the way she did everything. Then she stood up and said, "Finish the post before the ground firms up again." I picked up the spade. The creek was running loud behind me, and the light was doing what spring light does when you're somewhere you intend to stay, and I set the post in the hole and started tamping the earth. That was enough, more than enough, the kind of enough that doesn't need anything added to it. The tannery ran for 23 years after that. Both our names on the deed. 7 women who knew more about the operation than anyone who came looking to buy it, which is why no one ever did buy it, because we were never selling. There were better years and worse. There was a flood in '89 that took out the lower Vats, which I rebuilt in 3 weeks, which Nora thought was too fast, and she was right, and I rebuilt one of them again the following spring. There was a drought in '91 that cut our cattle supply, and we shifted to sheep hides for 18 months, which Disna said she'd refused to do before because the smell was worse. The smell was worse. We did it anyway. What I know is this. I came to that valley with 55 cents and a deed I'd won in a card game and a bad eye and no particular plan. What I found was a broken building and 7 women who'd been running it on nothing but will and skill and had kept the whole thing alive when any man would have told you it was finished. What I found was work that needed doing. What I found, eventually, was someone who looked at what I was and not at what I wasn't, and said, plainly, without performance, maybe this could be ours. At 46 years old, half-blind, smelling of tannery and cold, standing in a post hole with mud on my arms, I was the luckiest man in the territory. I have never once thought different,